How many books are there in the Bible, and can we read them all the same, or are they all the same? That's the question I'm going to be dealing with in this next session. The reality is that the Bible isn't one book, it's actually a collection of books, 66 in total. There's 39 books in the Old Testament and 27 in the New. And I'm actually going to read an extract, a quote from a book called The New Evidence That Demands a Verdict About the Bible. And this is what it says. The Bible stands alone as the only book ever written over a 1500-year span, authored by more than 40 individuals from every walk of life, including kings, military leaders, peasants, philosophers, fishermen, tax collectors, poets, musicians, statesmen, scholars, and shepherds. Not only was the Bible written by different people, but it was written in different places. We find Moses in the wilderness, Jeremiah in a dungeon, Daniel on a hillside and in a palace, Paul inside prison walls, Luke while traveling, John on an island. The Bible was written by different people in different places and at different times. David wrote in times of war and sacrifice, Jeremiah wrote in times of distress and isolation, Solomon in times of plenty, Paul in times of persecution and on different continents. We find the text is written in 3 different languages, Hebrew, Aramaic and Greek. And the styles vary as well, including poetry, narrative, song, romance, didactic treatise, personal correspondence, memoirs, satire, biography, autobiography, law, prophecy, parable, and allegory. It's pretty amazing that 66 books can be written by so many different people in such a wide variety of circumstances, and yet they have one thing in common. They tell the story, the redemptive story of God towards mankind. In other words, how God brought us into a relationship with Himself. And for me, the fact that these people lived in different places, never met each other, and yet wrote about God in the same way is an absolute miracle. So let's have a quick walk through the 66 books of the Bible. If you open up your Bible right in the beginning, there'll be a table of contents, and it gives a list of all the books. I'm just going to explain the different sections briefly. So the first 5 books of the Bible were written by Moses, and they are known as the books of the law. They contain account of creation, God beginning the story with mankind, how He chose Israel to be a people, how He brought them out of Egypt, and He gave them His laws. After that, from Joshua through to Esther, you have the historical books, and they really give a historical account of God's relationship with individuals and with nations. After that, you have the poetry books, and that's from Job through to Song of Solomon. And so when you read those, you really got to read them like poetry and not like a newspaper article or a letter or a historical article. And then from there, from Isaiah through to Malachi, the end of the Old Testament, you've got the prophetic books. And in the Old Testament times, God used to speak to His people through prophets. And so they really represented God and what He was saying to the people. And that's what these books contain. Sometimes they contain the consequences of not obeying God, but mostly they're just an invitation for people to have a relationship with God, an expression of His heart, His desire for His people to know Him and be in relationship with Him, and His heart to bless them. Moving on to the New Testament, the first 4 books of the New Testament are the Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And these are historical accounts of the life and teachings of Jesus. Then we got the book of Acts, which is a 30-year history of the church, how the church started and how it grew to be in different countries and different cities. And from Romans through to 2 Thessalonians, these are his letters to individual churches. And then from 1 Timothy through to Philemon, these are his letters to individuals. And then we move on to the letters that weren't written by Paul. And so this is from Hebrews through to Jude. And these are actually named after the person that wrote them. Obviously, Hebrews is named that because we don't really know who wrote it. Some people think Paul, some people think Apollos, but the reality is we don't know, but it makes for great reading. James wrote a letter, Peter wrote 2, John wrote 3, and then Jude wrote a really short one because he liked to get to the point. And then the last one is Revelation, and that's an apocalyptic prophetic book, meaning it deals with the last things that happen in the world, the end of the world and the return of Jesus. So that's a brief outline of the different books of the Bible, all 66 of them. And knowing what you're reading, knowing the type of book or the style of book that you're reading makes a massive difference to understanding it.